You think your past scares us. Evelyn Harper looked at the man standing in the wreckage of everything she had ever loved, and she didn't raise her voice. She didn't reach for anything. She just looked at him the way a mountain looks at a storm. Patient, unmoved, already knowing how this ends. My past doesn't scare people, she said quietly. My choices do. Nobody in Cedar Hollow ever thought the old widow with grease-stained hands would become the most dangerous person in the room. But danger, real danger, doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just waits. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button right now and drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, because what happened in that garage changed everything. The garage had a smell that most people couldn't place right away. It was motor oil, yes, and metal and rubber, and something older underneath all of that, something that belonged to another decade entirely, when men built things with their hands because they didn't have any other choice. Old tools hung on pegboard walls in arrangements that looked random, but weren't. Every wrench, every socket, every roll of electrical tape had a place that Evelyn Harper had assigned to it years ago, and nothing moved unless she moved it. She was 64 years old, and she had been opening that garage every morning since before some of the town's youngest residents were born. The building itself sat on the edge of the main highway that cut through Cedar Hollow, Colorado, the kind of small mountain town that people either grew up in and never left or stumbled into by accident and somehow stayed. The population was just under 3,000. Everybody knew everybody, and everybody knew Evelyn Harper, even if they didn't fully know what that meant. What they saw was a widow, blonde gray hair pulled back tight, faded work shirt with a name patch that read Evelyn in worn red thread, reading glasses she never remembered to put away, always hanging from the collar of her shirt or perched on top of her head like she'd forgotten them there. She moved through the garage with the kind of quiet confidence that comes not from arrogance, but from having done the same things thousands of times and knowing exactly what she was doing. She drank her coffee black. She worked alone most days. And she had one rule she'd kept for 20 years without breaking it. Once the garage opened at 7 in the morning, and nothing that happened outside those walls came inside. It was a good rule. It worked for a long time. Until the night Mason Cole decided it didn't apply to him. The first time Mason Cole walked into Harper's garage, it was a Tuesday evening in late September, and the air outside had already started carrying that early mountain cold that makes your breath visible if you're standing still. Evelyn was in the back working on a 1969 Triumph Bonneville that belonged to an 80-year-old man named Earl Whitfield, who drove it every summer and spent the rest of the year worrying about it. The engine needed new rings. It wasn't complicated work, but it required patience, and Evelyn had plenty of that. She heard the door. She didn't look up right away. That wasn't unusual. People wandered in sometimes, especially people passing through on the highway who needed directions or thought maybe she sold fuel. She didn't, but she kept a map taped to the wall near the entrance and a handwritten note that said, "Nearest gas 4 miles north," in letters big enough to read from the door. "Be right with you," she called out. There was no answer. She set down her wrench and wiped her hands on a rag. When she came around the side of Earl's Triumph, she found 4 men standing in the center of the garage, not looking at the motorcycles, not looking at the tools, looking at her. The one in front was Mason Cole, though she didn't know his name yet. He was in his early 30s, broad through the shoulders with the kind of deliberate casualness that people practiced in front of mirrors. Jacket, open hands in pockets. It's 1 foot slightly ahead of the other, like he'd arranged himself for a photograph. He had a way of looking at a space like he was already deciding what to do with it after the current owner was gone. The 3 behind him were younger. One of them was barely old enough to shave properly. They fanned out slightly when they entered, not all the way, but enough, like they'd done this before. "Mrs. Harper," Mason said. "That's me." "Nice place," he looked around slowly. "Heard you've been here a long time." 22 years, Evelyn said. She kept her voice neutral. She kept her hands where he could see them, not because she was afraid, but because she was paying attention. "Long time," Mason said. He picked up a small wrench from the nearest workbench and turned it over in his hand, not looking at it, still looking at her. "You know, a business like this out here on the highway by yourself, that's a vulnerable position." "I manage." "Sure you do." He set the wrench down, not where he'd picked it up from. "But things happen, you know, break-ins, vandalism. This town isn't as safe as it used to be. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. She recognized this conversation. She'd heard different versions of it in different decades in different places. The words changed. The meaning never did. Are you offering me something, she asked. Protection, Mason said. A small monthly arrangement. Keeps things smooth, keeps things safe. Protection from what? Mason smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. From whatever might happen. Evelyn pulled her reading glasses off her collar and set them carefully on the workbench beside her. She folded her hands. She looked at Mason Cole the way she'd once looked at men twice his size in rooms far more dangerous than a garage in the Colorado mountains, with the particular stillness of someone who has already run every version of this conversation to its conclusion and knows exactly where each one ends. No, she said. The word sat there in the air between them like a stone dropped in still water. Mason blinked, just once, like she'd said something in a language he didn't quite speak. Excuse me. No, Evelyn said again. I won't be paying you anything. I'd like you to leave my garage now. The youngest of the three men in the back made a small sound, not quite a laugh, more like the beginning of one that he caught before it came all the way out. Mason's jaw tightened just slightly. Mrs. Harper, his voice was still calm, still conversational. I think maybe you don't understand. I understand exactly what you're doing, Evelyn said. And my answer is no. It'll still be no tomorrow, and the day after that. She picked up her wrench from the workbench and went back toward Earl Whitfield's Triumph. There was a long pause. Then she heard the sound of boots on concrete, and then the door, and then they were gone. She crouched down beside the motorcycle and went back to work. Her young assistant, Lily Carter, found out what happened the next morning. Lily was 19, sharp-eyed with a natural aptitude for engines that Evelyn had spotted within the first week of the girl coming in looking for part-time work 2 years ago. She came from a family that had been in Cedar Hollow for 3 generations, and she had that particular quality that Evelyn had always valued most in anyone who worked alongside her. She didn't pretend to know things she didn't know, and she asked good questions. Who were they? Lily asked. She was standing very still the way she did when something had caught her full attention. Local, Evelyn said. I don't know the name of the operation, but I know the type. What did you tell them? No, Lily was quiet for a moment, and they just left. For now. Lily understood what that meant. She'd grown up in Cedar Hollow. She'd seen what had happened to the hardware store on Maple Street after the owner stopped paying broken supply lines inventory that went missing suppliers who suddenly couldn't make deliveries. She'd watched Tom McGuire at the diner across the highway start looking thinner and more tired, and then one day he'd had a new lock on the back door and a face that had gone very carefully blank whenever anyone asked how business was. Evelyn, she said, I know. These guys, people are scared of them. I know that too. So what are you going to do? Evelyn looked up from the parts diagram she'd spread across the workbench. She studied Lily for a moment with the kind of quiet attention that always made people feel simultaneously seen and measured. Same thing I do every day, she said. Open the garage, do the work, go home. Lily wanted to say more. Instead, she nodded and went to start the first job of the day. 3 days passed. Evelyn went about her mornings the same way she always had. Coffee at 6:30, black 2 cups. Garage by 7. Parts inventory on Mondays, customer calls. Tuesdays, whatever the work required for the rest of the week. There was a 1978 Honda CB750 waiting on new bearings and a rebuilt carburetor. There was a 1965 BSA Lightning that a man from Denver had trailered up because he didn't trust anyone closer to touch it. There was Earl Whitfield's Triumph, which was almost done. She worked and she waited the way she'd learned to do a long time ago in circumstances that Cedar Hollow would not have recognized. On the third evening, just after Lily left at 6 o'clock, they came back. Not Mason this time. He sent 4 of his men, the 3 from before, plus a 4th one she hadn't seen bigger than the others, with the look of someone who'd been hired specifically for situations that required size. They came in through the side entrance that Evelyn usually left unlocked until closing time. She was at the far end of the garage, her back to the door when she heard them come in. She heard the specific rhythm of 4 sets of feet spreading out across the space, not bunching up, not casual, deliberate. She knew the geometry of it without turning around. She set down her tool. She turned around slowly. Mason send you, she said. The biggest one said last chance. I already gave my answer. He shrugged. It was almost apologetic, the gesture, the way someone looks when they break something they weren't particularly trying to break. Then they started. It lasted 4 minutes. She counted afterward, going over it the way she'd been trained years ago to reconstruct events, not to relive them, but to understand them accurately. They moved through the garage with specific efficiency. This wasn't random anger. This was a message written in broken things. The side windows went first, safety glass. It shattered into thousands of small squares that covered the floor like a blanket of ice. The tool cabinet went over sideways, everything inside clattering out across the concrete. 3 of the customer bikes were knocked over in succession, the sound of each one hitting the ground, a particular kind of violence, because she knew what each one had cost and who had trusted her with it. Shelves came down. A workbench was overturned. Evelyn stood in the center of it and did not move. Not because she couldn't, because she was deciding. The biggest one watched her the whole time his colleagues worked, like he was waiting for her to break. She looked back at him with an expression he couldn't read because nothing in his experience had given him the vocabulary for it. Then one of the younger ones moved toward the back corner. The corner where Daniel's motorcycle had sat for 9 years under a canvas cover partially assembled, waiting. "Don't," Evelyn said. Her voice was quiet, quieter than anything she'd said yet. He didn't stop. The motorcycle, a 1971 Harley-Davidson Custom that Daniel Harper had been building from the frame up before his heart stopped without warning. On a Tuesday morning in November, came off its stand and hit the ground at an angle that bent the front fork and scattered 3 weeks of careful assembly work across the concrete. Lily Carter, who had come back because she'd forgotten her keys, appeared in the side doorway at exactly that moment. She saw the garage. She saw the men. She stepped back instinctively, and one of the men near the door shoved her. Not hard enough to do serious damage, but hard enough that she stumbled and went down on one knee on the broken glass outside the door. Evelyn heard the sound Lily made when her knee hit the ground. That was the moment. Not the windows, not the tools, not even Daniel's motorcycle, though that had come close. The moment was Lily Carter hitting the ground. Evelyn Harper reached up and removed her work gloves, one finger at a time. She set them on the overturned workbench beside her without looking at them. The whole process took maybe 6 seconds. When she looked up, the 4 men were watching her. The big one said, "You ready to reconsider?" Evelyn looked at him. She looked at each of the others in turn, slowly taking her time. "You should leave now," she said. "Og Mason Cole a message from me. Tell him I'll be seeing him soon." Something in the way she said it moved through the garage like a current. She couldn't have explained it. She didn't try to. She'd felt it happen before years ago in situations that made this one look uncomplicated. And she'd learned that some tones of voice bypass thought entirely and reach somewhere older and deeper. The big one held her gaze for a long moment. Then he looked away. They left. Evelyn stood in the middle of the wrecked garage for a long time without moving. All around her was the evidence of what they'd done. The broken glass, the scattered tools, the overturned furniture. And in the back corner, Daniel's motorcycle on its side on the concrete, the front fork bent at an angle that meant weeks more of work if the pieces were even salvageable. She breathed. She hadn't cried when Daniel died. She'd stood at his bedside and held his hand, and she hadn't cried until she was alone in the garage 3 days later, sitting on the floor next to his half-built motorcycle, and then she'd cried for a long time. She didn't cry now either. She went outside and found Lily sitting on the ground with her back against the building, picking small pieces of glass out of her palm with careful fingers. "Let me see," Evelyn said. "I'm okay." "I know you are. Let me see anyway." She crouched down next to Lily and took the girl's hand in both of hers and examined it carefully in the evening light. The cuts were shallow, nothing that needed more than cleaning in time. "Evelyn," Lily said. What are you going to do?" Evelyn was quiet for a while, holding Lily's hand, looking at the cuts. "I'm going to clean up my garage," she said finally. And then I'm going to make a phone call." The phone call she made that night wasn't to the police, though she called them too after and filed a report with the kind of patient, detailed accuracy that the young deputy on duty found slightly unnerving. She listed every item, damaged every item, destroyed the approximate value of each, the time and duration of the incident, a physical description of each of the 4 men that was so precise the deputy found himself writing faster than he usually did. He asked her if she was all right. She said she was fine and thanked him for coming out. After he left, she made the other call. She stood outside in the cold with her phone, and she dialed a number she hadn't dialed in years long enough that she'd half wondered if it would still work, if the person on the other end would still answer, if the life she'd lived before Cedar Hollow would still pick up when she called. It picked up on the second ring. The voice was older than she remembered, rougher, but immediately unmistakably the same. Evelyn, not a question, like he'd been expecting her to call eventually, and this was just that eventual moment arriving. Pete, she said, how long has it been? Too long. A pause. She heard wind on his end. He was outside somewhere. You calling to say hello, or you calling because something happened? Something happened. Another pause longer. How bad? Bad enough. You need anything? Evelyn looked up at the sky over Cedar Hollow, the mountains invisible in the dark, but present massive felt. She thought about what she'd promised herself the day she'd locked away the leather jacket in the patch and closed the door on the life she'd lived before Daniel, before the garage, before becoming the quiet widow with the grease-stained hands and the coffee habit and the 22 years of peace. She thought about Lily Carter with glass in her palm. She thought about Daniel's motorcycle on the concrete floor. She thought about Mason Cole's smile and the way he'd said the word protection like it meant something other than what it actually meant. Not yet, she said. I just need you to know what's happening. All right, and Pete, don't call anyone else yet. Let me handle this first. You sure? I'm sure. Evelyn, his voice went quieter. You've been out a long time. I know. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. Just be careful about the door you're opening. She was quiet for a moment. I'm not opening anything, she said. I'm just making sure it's still there. The next morning, she arrived at the garage at 6:50, 10 minutes earlier than usual. Lily was already there, sitting on the front step with a cup of coffee from the gas station 4 miles up the road. There were still glass fragments on the ground from the night before. Neither of them mentioned it. You didn't have to come in today, Evelyn said. I know I didn't. They went inside and started cleaning up. It took the better part of the morning. Evelyn worked methodically, tools sorted by category, larger debris first, then sweeping, then dealing with the workbenches and the shelving. Lily worked beside her without being asked, asking only the questions that needed answering and spending the rest of the time figuring things out herself. Around 10 o'clock, Lily stopped sweeping and looked at the back corner where Daniel's motorcycle lay. Can it be fixed? She asked. Evelyn had been thinking about this since the previous night. She'd gone over it in her mind the way she went over engine problems, methodically, without sentimentality, looking at what was actually there rather than what she'd wished was there. The frame is fine, she said. Fork needs to be replaced. Some of the assembly work got damaged when it fell, but it can be done. How long? Few weeks, maybe more. Lily nodded. She looked at the motorcycle for another moment, then went back to sweeping. By noon, the garage was functional again, if not fully right. The windows were temporarily covered with heavy plastic sheeting that rattled when the wind came down from the mountains. 3 of the customer bikes had damage that Evelyn was going to have to call the owners, about which was a conversation she was not looking forward to. The shelving would need to be replaced. The tool cabinet was bent, but still usable. Evelyn stood in the center of the space and looked around. The garage looked like what it was, a place that had been deliberately hurt. You couldn't mistake it for anything else, but it was still standing. It still worked. That mattered. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a man came in. I was in his 70s, lean with a face that had been outdoors for most of its existence, and silver hair that he wore pulled back. He walked through the front door and looked around the garage with the particular assessment of someone who had seen damaged spaces before and was cataloging what was wrong without being asked to. His name was Roy Bellant. He'd been in Cedar Hollow for about 8 years, which made him a relative newcomer by the town's standards. He lived on a small property north of town and occasionally brought his Indian chief in for service work. Evelyn liked him because he asked smart questions about his motorcycle and didn't pretend to know things he didn't. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Heard what happened, he said. Word travels fast in this town, Evelyn said. Always has. He came inside and looked at the plastic sheeting over the windows. He looked at the corner where Daniel's motorcycle had been righted and leaned against the wall. He looked at Lily, who was on the phone at the front desk talking to the insurance company, her voice careful and patient. Mason Cole's people, Roy asked. Evelyn looked at him. I know who he is, Roy said simply. Everybody in this town knows who he is, Everybody's just been waiting for him to get bored or make a mistake. And now, Evelyn said. Roy looked at her steadily. He had the eyes of someone who had made serious decisions before and didn't regret most of them. And now I think maybe he's made his mistake, he said. The question is, what happens next? Evelyn picked up a wrench from the workbench, not to use it, just to hold it the way she did sometimes when she was thinking. You know who I am, Roy? She asked. He looked at her for a long moment. I know who you were, he said carefully. Didn't know if you'd want me saying so out loud. I don't talk about it, she said. I noticed. But I'm asking you now, what do you know? Roy was quiet for a moment. I know that Evelyn Harper's name meant something once in circles that most people in this town have never moved in. I know that the woman who ran this garage for 22 years did it because she chose to, not because she had to. And I know, he paused. I know that there's a difference between a person who's gone quiet because they're weak and a person who's gone quiet because they decided quiet was what they wanted. Evelyn set down the wrench. Mason Cole doesn't know that difference, she said. No, Roy agreed. He doesn't. That evening, Mason Cole himself came to the garage. Not with his crew this time. He came alone, which Evelyn found either brave or stupid, or both simultaneously. He drove up in a dark pickup truck and walked in through the front door with his hands in his pockets, looking around at the plastic on the windows and the temporary repairs and the general evidence of the previous night with an expression that was carefully neutral. Evelyn was at the workbench. She didn't stop what she was doing when he came in. I heard you filed a police report, Mason said. I did. That was a mistake. I've made bigger ones. She turned to face him. What do you want, Mason? He seemed slightly thrown that she used his name. He hadn't introduced himself. I want you to reconsider, he said, recovering. What happened last night that was unfortunate? I don't want things to go further. Then they won't, Evelyn said, because I'm not paying you. That's not going to change. Mason tilted his head. He looked around the garage, slowly taking in the damage his men had done the night before with the expression of someone appraising real estate. You know what I don't understand about you, he said. People like you spend your whole life building something small. A little garage, a little reputation. And then when it's threatened, you dig in, like the small thing is worth more than your safety. Evelyn looked at him. The small thing is exactly what's worth protecting, she said. That's the whole point. Mason looked at her for a long moment. Who are you, he said, not rhetorically. Genuinely curious, she thought, in the way that dangerous people sometimes got curious just before they stopped being interested in the answer. I'm Evelyn Harper, she said. I own this garage. My husband built it, and I'd like you to leave it. Mason looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded slowly like he'd reached a conclusion. All right, he said, have it your way. He left. Lily, who had come out from the back room and been standing very still near the door to the storage area, let out a breath she'd been holding. He'll come back, she said quietly. Yes, Evelyn said. With more people. Yes. Are you scared? Evelyn picked up her coffee mug from the workbench and found it had gone cold. She looked at it for a moment. No, she said honestly. That's the thing, Lily. I'm not scared, and I probably should think harder about why that is. Lily looked at her, the kind of look that wanted to ask 100 questions and didn't know which one to lead with. Evelyn, she said finally, who were you before all this? Evelyn set down the mug. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, go home, Lily. Get some rest. Tomorrow we have work to do. She didn't answer the question, but the way she didn't answer it, the steadiness of it, the complete absence of embarrassment or evasion told Lily something she couldn't quite name. Something that felt like standing at the edge of a very deep place and understanding, without being able to see the bottom, that it was much deeper than it looked. That night, Evelyn Harper sat alone in the garage after everything was locked up. The plastic sheeting moved in the mountain wind. The temperature had dropped. She sat in the only chair that was still where it was supposed to be, in the corner beside the workbench, and she looked at the space around her. She looked at the pegboard walls and the tools on them. She looked at the customer bikes lined up along the far wall. She looked at the framed photograph on the shelf above the workbench. Daniel at 28 on a road she could still name if she tried, laughing at something the camera hadn't caught. She looked at the corner where his unfinished motorcycle leaned against the wall with the bent fork and the scattered parts that would take weeks to reassemble. She sat with it all, and somewhere inside the quietest part of her, the part that had been still for 20 years, the part she'd locked away along with the jacket and the patch and the name that people used to say with a particular weight. Something stirred. Not anger, not yet. Something older, something that recognized what was happening and understood with complete clarity that she had tried the quiet road. She had lived the quiet road for 2 decades, and she had loved it genuinely without reservation. But Mason Cole had made a miscalculation that men like him always eventually made. He had looked at a woman who had chosen peace and mistaken the choice for an absence of options. Evelyn sat in the dark garage for a while longer. Then she stood up, turned off the last light, and walked home through the cold mountain air. She had work to do. The morning after Mason Cole walked out of her garage, Evelyn Harper woke up at 5:15. Not because she had to, because she couldn't sleep past it. 20 years of early mornings had reset her internal clock so completely that her body refused the idea of sleeping late, even when her mind wanted to, even on the mornings when the weight of the previous day sat on her chest like something physical. She made her coffee, 2 cups black, the same as always. She stood at the kitchen window and drank the first one while it was still too hot, the way she always did, and she looked out at the dark street and the mountains she couldn't see but knew were there. She was thinking about Daniel, not the way she usually thought about him. The good memories, the easy ones, the way he laughed too loud at his own jokes, and the specific sound of him moving around the garage when he thought she wasn't paying attention. She was thinking about something he had said to her once years ago before they settled in Cedar Hollow, when they were still on the road and still figuring out who they were going to be for the rest of their lives. They'd been sitting outside somewhere in New Mexico late at night, and Daniel had looked at her and said, "You know what I admire most about you?" She'd said, "My mechanical skills, obviously." He'd laughed. Then he'd gotten serious the way he sometimes did, quickly, like a door swinging open. "It's that you never confuse peace with weakness," he said. "Most people either fight all the time or they lay down. You figured out there was a third thing." She'd asked what the third thing was. "Choosing," he said, "knowing exactly what you're capable of and deciding on purpose not to use it. That takes more strength than either of the other two." She finished her first cup of coffee in the kitchen and thought about that. Then she poured the second one and went to get ready for work. She had a plan. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of plan that involved a lot of moving pieces or a lot of other people. It was the kind of plan she'd always preferred: simple, direct, built on patience and clear thinking rather than reaction. Mason Cole wanted her to react. Every man who operated the way he operated wanted his targets to react because reaction was predictable, and predictable people were easy to manage. Evelyn Harper had never been predictable. When she arrived at the garage at 7, Roy Bellin's truck was parked out front. He was leaning against the hood with a paper cup of coffee, looking up at the mountains the way men his age sometimes did when they were thinking about something they weren't sure how to say. When he heard her car, he straightened up. "You don't have an appointment today," Evelyn said. "No, ma'am," Roy said. "I'm not here about the motorcycle." "Then why are you here?" He looked at her directly. Roy Ballant was not a man who looked away from things, which was one of the reasons she'd always found him worth talking to. "I've been asking around," he said, quietly, "about Cole's operation." Evelyn unlocked the front door and held it open. "Come inside." He told her what he'd found over the next 20 minutes. Sitting at the workbench across from her, speaking in the measured way of someone who had organized his information before presenting it. Mason Cole had been running his protection arrangement through Cedar Hollow for just under 2 years. He had, by Roy's count, 11 businesses currently paying him: the hardware store, 2 restaurants, a laundromat, the small motel on the south edge of town, an auto parts supplier, and several others. The amounts varied. The method was always the same: visit, pleasant conversation, demonstration of consequences, second visit, arrangement made. Only 2 businesses had refused. The first was a man named Garrett Owens, who owned the feed store on the north end of town. He'd refused for about 3 weeks. Then his delivery truck had been found with a destroyed engine. He paid after that. The second was Evelyn. "He's not going to stop," Roy said. "Men like this don't stop when someone says no. They stop when the cost of continuing becomes higher than whatever they're gaining." "I know that," Evelyn said. "So what's your thinking?" Evelyn wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "My thinking is that I'm not going to hide, and I'm not going to pay, and I'm not going to move. I'm going to open this garage every morning and do my work and let him figure out that he's miscalculated." Roy looked at her carefully. "That's a hard road. I've been on harder ones." There was a pause. Roy seemed to be deciding something. Evelyn, he said, I spent 12 years with the Marshal Service before I retired. I know how to build a case. I know what evidence looks like and how it needs to be handled. If you're willing, if you let me help, we could put something together that makes Cole impossible to ignore. She looked at him. Why, she said. Because I'm tired of watching this town be afraid, Roy said simply. And because I've been in Cedar Hollow 8 years, and in 8 years the most decent person I've met is sitting across from me right now, and I don't like what happened to her garage. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I don't need to be saved, Roy. I know you don't, he said immediately. That's not what I'm offering. She nodded slowly. All right, she said. We do this carefully and quietly, and we do it right. Agreed. He finished his coffee and stood up. One more thing, he said, and he said it the way people say things when they have been wondering how to say them for a while. The name Harper. Is there anything I should know? Evelyn looked up at him from the workbench. The name Harper is mine, she said. It belonged to my husband and now it belongs to me, and it means what I've made it mean in this town for 22 years. That's all you need to know right now. Roy nodded. He didn't push. Good man, she thought. He knew when he'd gotten an answer and when he hadn't, and he understood the difference. After he left, Lily arrived 10 minutes later, slightly out of breath, with a folder of papers from the insurance adjuster's office, and the expression of someone who had been running on 4 hours of sleep and too much gas station coffee. They want photographs, Lily said, of everything, every item, every piece of damage documented separately. Then we take photographs, Evelyn said. It's going to take all morning. Then it takes all morning. Lily set the folder on the workbench and looked at Evelyn. She did this sometimes, just looked at her directly the way young people do when they're trying to figure out how someone older than them is holding themselves together in a situation that would take them apart. How are you doing? Lily said, not the casual version of the question, the real one. I'm all right, Evelyn said. You don't have to say that. I know I don't. Evelyn picked up the folder and opened it. I'm saying it because it's true. I'm not all right about Daniel's motorcycle, but I'm all right about what we're going to do next. Sometimes those two things are separate. Lily thought about that for a moment. That's a very grown-up way to think about things. Give it 30 years, Evelyn said. You'll get there. They spent the morning documenting the damage. Lily took photographs. Evelyn wrote descriptions in the careful, specific language she'd learned a long time ago from people who had needed to document things accurately and quickly. By 11:30, they had everything the insurance company needed in a separate set of copies that Evelyn set aside in a folder she labeled simply Record. She was building something, not a confrontation, not yet, something more foundational. A record. Evidence, the kind of groundwork that people who had operated in dangerous situations knew to lay before anything else, because everything built on top of it either stood or fell, depending on how solid the foundation was. Around noon, Tom McGuire from the diner across the highway came in. Tom was in his early 50s, a big man who moved like someone who'd carried heavy things his whole life and had gotten both stronger and more tired from it. He'd run the diner for 15 years. He had a wife and 2 kids who were grown and gone in a regular breakfast crowd that had been loyal to him for longer than some of them had been married. He stood in the doorway of the garage with his hands at his sides and looked at the plastic sheeting over the windows, and his jaw worked for a moment before he spoke. I heard, he said. Come in, Tom. He came in and stood near the first workbench and didn't seem to know what to do with his hands. I'm sorry, he said, about the garage, about everything. It's not your fault. No, but he stopped, started again. I've been paying him for 8 months. I want you to know that it's not because I agree with it or because I'm okay with it. It's because I didn't know what else to do. My insurance doesn't cover the kind of damage these people do, not in a way that saves the business, and I've got people working for me who need their jobs. And Tom, Evelyn said quietly, I'm not judging you. He looked at her. His eyes were reddish at the edges. Everyone just keeps paying, he said, because everyone thinks they're the only one who's scared. But we're all scared. Every single business on this street, we're all scared, and we all think everyone else is managing better than we are. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. What if you knew you weren't the only one, she said. Tom was quiet. What if the people paying him knew that the fear they feel privately is the same fear everyone else feels, she said. What do you think would happen? Tom looked at the floor. He thought about it genuinely. She could see him thinking, turning the question over. I think maybe someone might be brave enough to stop, he said slowly, if they knew they weren't stopping alone. That's what I think too, Evelyn said. He looked up at her. What are you doing, Evelyn? I'm opening my garage every morning, she said. Same as always. You should keep doing the same. Don't pay him next month, Tom. Not yet. Wait and see what happens. That's easy to say. I know it is. She held his gaze. Trust me for a little while. He left without making any promises. But when he walked out the door, his back was a little straighter than when he'd come in. Small things, Evelyn thought. Small things were how large things started. Word was moving through Cedar Hollow. She could feel it. Not fast. This wasn't the kind of town where things move fast, but steadily, the way water moved through rock imperceptibly and unstoppably. People had heard that Evelyn Harper's garage had been hit. People had heard that she'd filed a police report and refused to pay and was still opening the garage every morning the same as always. People were talking about it in the way that small towns talked about things that mattered quietly in small groups, at kitchen tables and in parking lots, sharing information in the careful private way of people who aren't sure yet whether the thing they're talking about is going to turn out to be something they can admit to being part of. What they were saying at the core of it was a single question. If she's not scared, why are we? Evelyn knew that question was in the air. She was counting on it. On the fourth day after the break-in, she got a call she had been waiting for without being sure it would come. The number was from out-of-state Wyoming. She saw from the area code, though the man who called was not from Wyoming, and both of them knew it. His name was Carter Briggs, and he was 61 years old, and he had been on the road with the Hells Angels for 34 of those years before a knee injury and a long stretch of very clear thinking had moved him into the kind of life that involved a ranch property and a small stable and a dog named Roosevelt. He and Evelyn had ridden together for 8 years before she met Daniel. He was the one person from that time who had stayed in contact reliably, consistently, not as an obligation, but as a genuine friendship that had survived the decades and the distance and the very different lives they'd built. She hadn't told him what happened. He'd found out anyway, which didn't surprise her. Pete called me, Carter said. Pete was the man that she'd called the night of the break-in, Peter Vance, 65, another former member, who had apparently made his own calls after hanging up with Evelyn, despite her telling him not to. I told Pete not to call anyone, Evelyn said. I know you did. Pete doesn't take instructions well, you know that. I know that. Evelyn, Carter's voice settled into the tone he used when something was important. She knew this tone. She'd heard it in situations where important things were happening around them, and he was trying to make sure she was hearing him clearly. Tell me what's going on, she told him. Not in detail. She didn't do anything in detail on the phone if she could avoid it. Old habit, hard to break, but enough. The protection scheme. The break-in, Daniel's motorcycle, Lily on the ground, Mason Cole standing in the garage asking her who she was. When she was done, Carter was quiet for a moment. This Cole, he said, he doesn't know. No, Evelyn said, he doesn't. Because if he did, he wouldn't have started this in the first place. I know. Another pause. What do you need? Right now, nothing. I'm handling it. You shouldn't handle it alone. I'm not alone. I have Roy. Who's Roy? Former marshal. Good man. We're building a case. Carter absorbed this. And when the case is built, then we'll see. Evelyn. He said her name the way people said names when the name itself was the whole message. You know that half the people I know would drive to Colorado tomorrow if you asked them to. I know that. And you're not asking. Not yet, she said. Carter, not yet. I need to try this the right way first. The whole point is that I walked away from the other way. I need to know I've used everything before I fall back on it. He was quiet for the long moment. I'll respect that, he said finally. But Evelyn, if it goes sideways, I'll call you. You'll actually call. Not just think about calling and then try to handle everything yourself, because you always handle everything yourself. She almost smiled. I'll call. After she hung up, she stood in the garage for a while. The afternoon light was coming through the plastic sheeting in the windows and casting strange shadows across the floor. Lily was at the front desk working on a parts order. The radio was on low something old. She couldn't quite place the song, but recognized the decade. She went to the back corner where Daniel's motorcycle leaned against the wall. She crouched down and picked up the bent fork, carefully turning it in her hands, feeling the exact angle of the damage. It was repairable. She'd known that from the moment it happened, even in the middle of everything else, the part of her mind that was always assessing mechanical problems had registered repairable. The assessment had happened automatically without permission because that was what her mind did with broken things. She set it down carefully. She put her hand flat on the side of the frame where Daniel's name was stamped in small letters. Not big, not showy, just D. Harper, the way he'd had it done years ago because he'd wanted something permanent and something modest at the same time. She held her hand there for a moment. I know, she said quietly. To him or to herself, the line between the two had blurred considerably in the 9 years since he died. I know. She stood up and went back to work. That evening, Mason Cole sent a message through a third party, a young man who came into the garage just before closing and said he was there to talk and had the look of someone who had been given very specific instructions and was repeating them very carefully. The message was simple. Mason was offering one final opportunity for agreement, a reduced monthly fee, a guarantee of no further incidents, a clean resolution. The young man delivering the message was nervous. Evelyn noticed his hands. They were moving slightly, not quite trembling, but close. She felt a pang of something, not sympathy for the situation, but for the kid specifically because he was maybe 22 years old. And he was clearly in something he hadn't fully understood when he got into it and now didn't know how to get out of. What's your name? She said. He blinked. Ma'am. Your name. What is it? Denny. Denny, she said. How long have you been working for Mason Cole? He looked uncomfortable. I'm just delivering a message. I know. How long? About a year, he said, quietly, like confessing something. Do you like it? He didn't answer. The answer was in the not answering. Tell Mason Cole, Evelyn said, that my answer is still no. It will always be no. And tell him to stop sending people because the next people he sends will be talking to my lawyer and to the sheriff's department and possibly to the federal investigators that a retired marshal I know has some contact with. She watched that land. Denny's eyes went slightly wider. I'd also suggest, she said more gently, that you think carefully about what you're doing and who you're doing it for. While you still have the option to think about it. He left quickly. She watched him go and felt the complicated mixture of things she always felt when she had to be hard with someone who was more scared than dangerous, the necessity of it and the heaviness of it existing simultaneously, neither one canceling the other out. Roy came by that evening as she was closing up. I've been talking to Deputy Wills, he said. Deputy Sandra Wills was the youngest officer on the Cedar Hollow force, the one who'd taken Evelyn's report the night of the break-in, and apparently the one Roy had decided was worth cultivating as an ally. She's sharper than she looks. She's been noticing things for months, patterns in the incidents around town. Nothing she could connect until she heard about your report. Your documentation gave her something to anchor to. What does she think she can build? She thinks with time and the right cooperation from the businesses involved, she can build something solid, but she needs people to talk. People are scared. Yes, but they're less scared than they were a week ago. He looked at her. You walking into that garage every morning, you have no idea what that's doing to people in this town. Evelyn frowned slightly. I'm going to work. I know, but they see you going to work, and they see that Cole hasn't stopped you, and they see that nothing catastrophic has happened to you, and they start doing the math. He shook his head slightly. You've been here 22 years, Evelyn. People trust you more than you know. You going about your business like it's nothing that's braver to them than anything dramatic would be. She thought about that while she locked up the front. Roy, she said, have you ever heard the name Harper before Cedar Hollow? I mean in a different context. He was careful with the pause. I've heard things, he said, old things, the kind of things that people mention in certain company if a name comes up. What kind of things? That there was a woman with that name who was that the name meant something once in a particular world, that she was known for being fair and for being someone you didn't go against unless you had to. He looked at her sideways, and that she walked away from all of it at some point, completely, and nobody heard much after that. Evelyn was quiet. I never asked, Roy continued, because it was clear you didn't want to talk about it. And because whatever you were then what you are now in this town is what matters to me. She looked at him for a long moment. What I was then is part of why I know what I'm doing now, she said. I'm not hiding from it. I just don't lead with it. Fair enough. She drove home in the dark and sat in her kitchen and thought about the phone call she'd made and the ones that had come in the careful foundational work she and Roy were building. She thought about Tom McGuire's reddened eyes and Denny's nervous hands, and Deputy Will's and the way word was moving through Cedar Hollow like water through rock. And she thought about Mason Cole. She thought about the specific type of confidence. He had the kind that came from never having encountered real resistance. He'd built his operation on a simple assumption that people with small things to lose would always eventually protect those small things by giving him what he wanted. It was a workable strategy against most people. Against most people, the calculation was correct. What he had not factored in, could not have factored in, because he didn't know, was that the woman in the garage on the highway wasn't protecting a small thing. She was protecting something that couldn't be measured in insurance claims or monthly fees or broken tools. She was protecting the life she and Daniel had chosen deliberately with full knowledge of what they were walking away from when they chose it. She was protecting the proof that the choice had been real, that the 22 years of peace had been genuine, not just absence of conflict, but active chosen peace meaningful in a way that required protecting. And she was protecting Lily Carter, who was 19 and sharp and good, and had glass cuts on her palm from hitting a concrete doorstep, and who deserved to grow up in a town where people like Mason Cole didn't win. She made one more call before she went to sleep. Carter answered on the first ring this time. "I need to know if people would come," she said. "Not now, but if I called, I need to know if the answer would be yes." There was a pause on Carter's end, just a short one. "Evelyn," he said, "the day you call and ask, there will be people in their cars before you finish the sentence." She breathed. "I'm not asking yet," she said. "I know," Carter said, "but now you know too." She hung up and sat in her quiet kitchen. The house was the same house she and Daniel had bought when they settled in Cedar Hollow. The same walls, the same furniture, the same particular quality of silence that a house develops over decades of being lived in by the same people. She sat in it and felt it around her. Somewhere across town, Mason Cole was in whatever room he occupied at night, and he was thinking about a stubborn old widow who wouldn't give him $200 a month and wondering how much harder he'd have to push before she broke. He didn't know. He had absolutely no idea. And tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock, Evelyn Harper's was going to open her garage, drink her black coffee, and go back to work on Earl Whitfield's 1969 Triumph Bonneville because the job needed doing, and because she had a reputation for finishing what she started, and because sometimes the most powerful thing you could possibly do was simply refuse to stop. Earl Whitfield came to pick up his Triumph on a Thursday morning, and he stood looking at it for a long time before he said anything. Earl was 81 years old. He'd ridden motorcycles since he was 17, and he had the particular relationship with machines that men of his generation developed, not ownership, exactly more like partnership. The understanding that a machine well-maintained would carry you and a machine neglected would kill you, and that the difference between those two outcomes was entirely on you. He trusted Evelyn with the Triumph for 3 years running, and she had never once given him a reason to wish he'd gone somewhere else. He walked around it slowly. He crouched down, which cost him something at his age, and looked at the engine from the side. He put his hand on the tank the way you put your hand on the shoulder of something you love. "She sounds right," he said finally. "She sounds right," Evelyn confirmed. Earl stood back up slowly and looked at Evelyn. He had eyes that had seen a great deal and had developed the quality of measuring things carefully before arriving at conclusions. He looked at the plastic sheeting still covering 2 of the windows. He looked at the replacement shelving that was slightly different from the original. He looked at the back corner where Daniel's motorcycle was propped against the wall with the new fork laid against it, not yet installed, still in its packaging. "I heard what happened," he said. "I figured you had. And I heard you're still here." He said it in a tone that was not quite admiring and not quite surprised, somewhere between the two. Like a man recalibrating an estimate he'd already had fairly high. "Where else would I be?" Earl looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said something she didn't expect. "My wife's brother rode with some people up in Montana," he said. "Long time ago, early 70s. He talked about a woman young back then who was riding with one of the bigger groups down south, said she was the only person he'd ever seen who could walk into a room full of dangerous men and make them all feel like behaving themselves without saying a single word." He paused. He never said her name, but he talked about her for 40 years. Evelyn held his gaze. "Earl," she said, How much do I owe you for the new ignition switch on that thing? I installed it and forgot to put it on the invoice. He understood. He paid and he shook her hand, and when he rode the Triumph out of the garage, the engine sound was clean and even and exactly right, and Evelyn stood in the doorway and listened to it until she couldn't hear it anymore. Lily appeared at her elbow. What was that about? Old bike, Evelyn said. Old man, old story. She turned back inside. We have work to do. But the town was doing something now that Evelyn could feel without being able to fully see. Stories were moving. Not the story Earl had told her, something smaller than that, more immediate. The story of the garage and the woman who wouldn't close it. People were repeating it to each other in the way that certain stories get repeated, not because the facts were dramatic, but because the facts meant something. Because in a town full of people who had been quietly afraid for 2 years, the image of Evelyn Harper arriving at 7 in the morning and turning on the lights and going to work had taken on a weight that had nothing to do with motorcycles. She was aware of it. She wasn't comfortable with it. She had spent 22 years deliberately not being a symbol of anything, and the feeling of becoming one now was both useful and unsettling in equal measure. On the 6th day after the break-in, Mason Cole made his next move. She heard about it, not from Roy, not from Deputy Wills, but from Lily, who heard about it from her cousin, who worked at the small grocery on the east side of town. Mason's men had gone back to 3 of the businesses that had been paying and doubled the monthly fee. Without warning, without negotiation, just doubled it effective immediately with the explanation delivered, simply costs had gone up. Tom McGuire's fee had been $200. It was now $400. Evelyn heard this and sat very still for a moment. He's escalating, Roy said when she called him. He'd already heard. This is what happens when someone doesn't respond the way he expects. He doesn't change strategy, he increases pressure. It's a control pattern. He can't process the fact that you're not moving, so he pushes harder on everything else. He's punishing the town for my refusal, Evelyn said. Yes, he's making the calculation that the town will eventually turn on you, that they'll start resenting you for costing them money. She thought about that. It was not a stupid calculation. It was actually fairly sophisticated, using the community against her rather than coming at her directly. Men who survived in that kind of operation for any length of time were not stupid. Mason Cole had lasted 2 years in Cedar Hollow without serious challenge, which meant he understood human psychology well enough to keep working it. What he still didn't understand was who he was working it against. Let me talk to Tom, she said. Tom McGuire's diner smelled like coffee and eggs in the specific combination of grease and cleaning solution that every short-order kitchen in America smelled like, the smell that meant people had been fed here and would be fed here again, and that this was a place built for exactly that purpose. Evelyn sat across from Tom in a booth near the back, away from the counter, and she watched him turn a coffee cup in his hands repeatedly while he talked. $400, Tom said. A month. That's not going to put me out of business tomorrow, but it's not nothing. It's my Wednesday and Thursday margins, basically. If it goes up again, it'll go up again, Evelyn said. Tom stopped turning the cup. He looked at her. That's how this works, she said. You pay $400, and in 3 months, it's 6, then 8. There's no number you can reach where he's satisfied and stops asking for more. That's not how the arrangement works. The arrangement is designed to be permanent. Tom's jaw tightened. So what am I supposed to do? You're telling me not to pay, but if I don't pay, something happens to the diner, and you pay to fix it, which costs more than the fee. I know. She looked at him steadily. Tom, I need you to trust me for a little longer. You keep saying that. I know. How much longer? She held his gaze. Not long. He searched her face. She let him look. She didn't give him more than that because she didn't have more than that yet. She had the beginning of something, a foundation, pieces moving into position, but not enough to promise him a specific outcome by a specific date. What she had was conviction, which was real and genuine, and also the kind of thing you couldn't hand someone across a diner table no matter how much you wanted to. Evelyn, Tom said. He leaned forward. His voice went quieter. People are talking about you. You know that. I know. Old stories. People who've been here a long time. People whose parents were here. They're saying things about you that I've known you 15 years and I thought I knew. He stopped, looked at his coffee cup, looked back up. Is it true? She was quiet for a moment. What are people saying? She said. that you weren't always just a mechanic. She looked at him for a long time. The diner noise moved around them plates, conversation, the bell above the front door. As someone came in, someone went out. I was always a mechanic, she said finally. I just wasn't always only a mechanic. Tom absorbed that. Pay him this month, she said. One more month. I need one more month. He nodded slowly, like a man committing to something he wasn't sure about and deciding to do it anyway because the person asking had earned it. She left the diner and stood outside in the cold air for a moment. The mountains were visible today, sharp against a sky that was the specific hard blue of Colorado in October. She breathed. She thought about what Roy was building and what Deputy Wills was building and how those two things needed to connect. And she thought about the businesses that were now paying double and the pattern of escalation and what Mason Cole would do next when doubling the fees still didn't make her move. She already knew what he'd do next. He'd come back to the garage, not to negotiate, not to deliver messages through nervous young men. He'd come back the way men like him always eventually came back to the thing that had refused them with everything he had because his authority required it, because one visible refusal left standing was worth more to the resistance than 10 quiet capitulations were worth to him. He would come back. And this time she needed to be ready in a different way. She called Carter Briggs from the parking lot of Tom's Diner. How quickly could people be in Colorado, she said when he picked up. There was a pause shorter than the ones before. Define quickly. If I called tonight, 24 to 36 hours, Carter said. Depending on where they're coming from. Some closer. How many? However many you need, Evelyn. She breathed. I'm not asking yet, she said. I know, but you're closer to asking. Yes, she said, I'm closer. She hung up and drove back to the garage. Roy was waiting inside. He had papers spread across the workbench, printed copies notes in his small, precise handwriting, a timeline that he'd constructed across 3 sheets taped together. She looked at it. He had documented 11 months of incidents across Cedar Hollow, cross-referenced with the payment records that 3 business owners had quietly agreed to share with him, documented with dates and amounts and the specific language of the threats that had been made. Deputy Wills had added 3 official incident reports that had previously been filed without clear context and were now clearly part of the same pattern. It was good work. It was careful, thorough, the kind of documentation that made federal investigators interested rather than skeptical. This is enough to take somewhere, Roy said. It's enough to take somewhere, Evelyn agreed. It's not enough to stop him before he does something worse. No, Roy said, it's not. They looked at each other across the workbench with the papers between them. How much time do you think we have? Roy said. Days, Evelyn said. A week at most. He doubled the fees 2 days ago. That means he's frustrated and he's escalating and he's running out of patience. When men like this run out of patience, they stop being strategic and start being reactive. And reactive is more dangerous. Sometimes, Evelyn said, sometimes it's also what you need. Roy looked at her carefully. What does that mean? It means a patient, strategic Mason Cole is harder to beat. A frustrated, reactive Mason Cole makes mistakes. She picked up the timeline Roy had built and studied it. He's going to come back here. I can feel it. And when he does, she said, I want this documented and I want Deputy Wills ready and I want the businesses on this street knowing what to do. She set the papers down. And I want to be ready for what comes after. Roy was quiet for a moment. Then, the phone calls you have been making. She looked at him. I'm not asking you to tell me about them, he said carefully. I want to know if I should be prepared for something I don't know about. Evelyn considered him. Roy Ballant was a man who had spent 12 years in a profession that required him to trust people and also to know exactly when to ask questions and when not to. He had earned the directness of the question. People who knew me a long time ago, she said. People from before Cedar Hollow. If things go in a direction I can't manage with what we're building here, I have options. What kind of options? The kind, she said, that Mason Cole has no framework for. Roy looked at her for a long moment. Then he said simply, all right, and went back to his paperwork. The next morning brought the first real crack in Mason Cole's operation, and it came from a direction Evelyn hadn't anticipated. Denny, the nervous young man who delivered Mason's last message, came into the garage just after 8 o'clock. He came in alone, without announcement, wearing regular clothes and the expression of someone who had spent several nights not sleeping. Lily saw him first and started to say something, but Evelyn held up one hand and Lily went quiet. "Denny," Evelyn said. "I need to talk to you," he said. He looked behind him at the door, then back at her. "Alone, if that's okay." Evelyn looked at Lily. Lily took the hint and went to the back. "Sit down," Evelyn said. He sat on the stool near the first workbench, hunched forward, elbows on knees. He was young up close, younger than she'd initially registered. 21, maybe 22, with the face of someone who had made decisions they couldn't figure out how to unmake. "I want out," he said. "I want to get out, and I don't know how." Evelyn pulled up a stool across from him. She sat down. She didn't say anything immediately because the immediate response was not always the right one, and she had learned a long time ago that silence placed correctly told you more than questions. "I've been with Cole's operation for 14 months, Denny said. "I started because it doesn't matter why I started. I stayed because I was scared. And now I'm more scared, but for different reasons." He looked at her. "He's talking about you, Cole, about you specifically, about the garage." His voice dropped. "He's not the way he's talking isn't like the way he talks about businesses that won't pay. It's different. It's personal." Evelyn's expression didn't change. "What's he saying?" she said. "He keeps asking who you are. Like he knows you won't pay, but he can't figure out why. And it's gotten in his head. He had someone look you up. Your name, the garage, the registration, everything. And then one of the older guys who runs with us," he stopped. "Keep going," Evelyn said. "One of the older guys, Reeves, he's maybe 50. He's been around a long time. When Cole mentioned your name, Reeves got real quiet, like the name meant something to him. And Cole asked him what was wrong, and Reeves said he said Harper. You sure about that name?" And Cole said yes, and Reeves didn't say anything else, but he left that same day, and nobody's seen him since. Evelyn sat very still. "Reeves," she said, "describe him." Denny described a man with silver-streaked hair, a scar along his left jawline, who drove a black Road King and had been loosely affiliated with Cole's operation for about 6 months without being a core member. He was in his early 50s. He'd shown up from out of state. Evelyn knew who he was. She didn't say so. She looked at Denny instead, at this 22-year-old who had come to her because she was the only person in Cedar Hollow he could think of who might help him and not hurt him. And she thought about the calculation she needed to make, because Denny coming to her was valuable in more than one way. And she had to be honest with herself about that, had to make sure that she was helping him because he needed help and not only because he was useful. She decided it was both and that both was all right. "If you're willing to talk to a law enforcement contact of mine," she said, "someone I trust, a former marshal, and if you're willing to give a detailed account of what you've seen in 14 months working for Cole, I can help you get out." Denny looked at her like she'd said something in a language he understood but hadn't expected to hear. "Why would you help me?" he said. "I brought you Cole's messages. I was part of—" "You're 22 years old," Evelyn said. "And you came here and told me that he's planning something against this garage instead of going home and pretending you didn't know." She looked at him steadily. "That matters." He looked at the floor for a moment. When he looked back up, his eyes were wet, and he was visibly not dealing with that, the way young men didn't deal with that. "He's going to come on a Thursday," Denny said. "That's what he said. He goes on Thursdays because it's the slowest day for most businesses and there are fewer witnesses around." Today was Monday. "Thank you," Evelyn said. She called Roy from the back of the garage while Lily sat with Denny and made him coffee. "Thursday," she told Roy. Roy was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "That's 3 days." "3 days," she said. "Can Wills be ready?" "I'll make sure she is. I need her and at least 2 other officers positioned before he arrives, not visible. I need the documentation package ready to hand over the moment it's over. And I need the 3 business owners who agreed to cooperate to have their written statements ready." "Evelyn, I know it's fast, Roy. It's very fast." "I know." She paused. "He's going to bring in his whole crew. This isn't going to be 4 men doing damage quietly. This is going to be a statement." "Then we need to be ready for a statement." "Yes," she said, "we do." She up, and then she stood in the small back room for a moment, and she made the call she'd been building toward since the night of the break-in. Carter answered before the second ring. "Thursday," she said. "We'll be there Wednesday night," Carter said. No hesitation. not even a breath of it. Carter, I need you to understand this needs to go a specific way. The law enforcement piece has to happen first. Roy and Deputy will have the documentation. When Cole arrives, the police are present, and this ends legally. What you and whoever comes with you are for is presence, witness, a reminder that she is not without people. You want us there, but you don't want us to do anything. I want you there, she said. What that does to people who see you, that's not doing anything. That's just existing. Carter made a sound that was partly a laugh, mostly appreciation. God, I miss the way you think. This has to work the right way, she said. I need it to work the right way. It will, he said. I promise you. We come, we stand, and we let the moment do what it does. After she hung up, she went back out into the garage. Lily was still sitting with Denny talking to him quietly, with the ease of a young woman who didn't have a complicated relationship with kindness and just deployed it when it was needed. Evelyn watched them for a moment. Denny looked up and saw her. Are you going to be okay, he said. The question surprised her, the direction of it, his concern aimed at her rather than himself. Yes, she said. He's bringing a lot of people Thursday. I know. I mean a lot. Like the whole crew plus people from 2 other towns he's brought in. Denny's hands were clasped tight. He wants it to be visible. He wants people to see. Evelyn felt something move through her. Not fear, she identified it after a moment clarity. The specific mental sharpening that happened when a situation that had been building for days crystallized into something with a fixed point, a moment you could orient toward. Good, she said. Denny blinked. Good, but if he wants it to be visible, Evelyn said, then we'll make sure it's visible. The next 2 days moved differently than the days before them. Faster, but also with the particular quality of time in the hours before something happens. Each moment slightly more present than usual, colors a little sharper, conversations a little more weighted. Evelyn noticed it and didn't fight it. It was familiar. She had stood on the edge of things before. Roy moved with quiet efficiency that she found genuinely impressive. Within 24 hours, he had Deputy Wills briefed and committed 2 additional officers from the next county, arranged out of uniform, present as private citizens, but armed and ready, and the 3 cooperating business owners with signed statements in hand. He had contacted the state investigative office and had the documentation package uploaded to a secure file they could access from a laptop in the garage. He had done all of this without drama, without announcement, without anything that might reach Mason Cole's ears. Former Marshal, Evelyn said when he showed her the completed package Wednesday morning. Habits don't go away, Roy said, even when the badge does. Lily knew something was coming. She hadn't been told specifics, but she had the perceptiveness of someone who paid close attention to the people around them, and she had been watching Evelyn and Roy move through the past 48 hours with the quiet, directed energy of people who knew what was on the horizon. On Wednesday evening, after the garage closed, she came to Evelyn and said, I want to be here tomorrow. Evelyn looked at her. I know you're going to tell me to go home, Lily said, and I know why, but I want to be here. Lily. He pushed me, Lily said. Her voice was steady. In my own place of work. He sent his people in here and one of them put their hands on me. And I want to be here when it ends. Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. You stay at the back, she said, behind the workbench. You don't come forward under any circumstances. If anything goes wrong. Nothing will go wrong, Lily said. If anything goes wrong, Evelyn repeated firmly, you go out the back door and you call Roy's number. That's your job. Can you do that job? Yes, Lily said. All right. That night, the first motorcycles arrived in Cedar Hollow. Carter Briggs came first, pulling up outside Evelyn's house at 9:30 in the evening, parking his bike and coming to the door in the unhurried way of a man who had ridden a significant distance without being hurried by it. He was 61 and looked also like someone who the years had made denser rather than thinner in the way that some people were. He had a face that had earned every line on it. Evelyn opened the door before he knocked. They looked at each other for a moment. 20 years. There was a great deal of 20 years in the 2 seconds before either of them spoke. You look exactly the same, Carter said. You look old, she said. He laughed and she stepped back to let him in, and they sat at her kitchen table and drank coffee and talked for 2 hours. Not about tomorrow, not yet, but about the 20 years between then and now. About the people they'd both known and where they'd gone. About Daniel for a while, Carter had known Daniel well, had been at their wedding, had watched Evelyn become someone different, and understood why, and agreed with it completely. About Cedar Hollow and the garage and Lily and the town that had spent 2 years afraid. Around midnight, Carter said, Pete is 20 minutes out. Kellerman and Dominguez are coming from Pueblo ETA about 1 in the morning. Rhodes is how many, Carter? Evelyn said. He looked at her steadily. 23, he said. She was quiet. Evelyn, I want to be clear about something, Carter said. Every person coming tomorrow, they're not coming because of the old days. They're not coming because of the patch or the name or any of that. They're coming because of you, because of who you are and what you've built in this town and what was done to it. He leaned forward slightly. You spent 20 years being a different kind of person than you were. You think we didn't notice. You think we didn't respect it. You chose something and you held it. That matters to people. Evelyn looked at her coffee cup. I just want this to go right, she said quietly. It'll go right, Carter said. The riders arrived through the night, quietly parking wherever there was room without announcing themselves or gathering in groups. Cedar Hollow was a small town and would notice eventually, but not tonight. Tonight they distributed themselves and waited, and the town slept without knowing what the morning would bring. Evelyn didn't sleep. She sat in the kitchen with the lights low and the coffee pot working steadily, and she went over every piece of what was in place. Roy's position with Deputy Wills 2 blocks away, ready to move when she called. The 3 cooperating business owners who would be on the street at the right moment. Denny safely out of town since Tuesday at a location Roy knew about. Lily at home under strict instructions not to arrive before 8:30. She thought about Daniel. She thought about him the way you think about someone who is gone, but still fully present in the decisions you make, in the values you hold, in the way you move through the world. She thought about what he'd said in New Mexico that night, about the third thing, about choosing, about the strength of knowing what you were capable of and deciding deliberately not to use it. She had chosen peace for 20 years. This was not the end of that choice. This was the choice asserting itself, the understanding that real peace required, defending that the life she'd built was worth protecting, that the town she'd lived in for 22 years deserved someone willing to stand still when everything else was trying to move. She stood up from the kitchen table at 6 o'clock and made her final cup of coffee and put on her work clothes and tied back her hair and drove to the garage. She arrived at 6:45. She unlocked the front door. She turned on the lights. She put on the radio, something old, the decade she couldn't quite place the melody familiar without being nameable. She picked up a wrench and went to work on Daniel's motorcycle. She worked on it for an hour, fitting the new fork, aligning it carefully, checking and rechecking the specifications against the notes she'd kept. Her hands were steady. The work was good. It was the kind of work that required full attention and gave it back, the kind that put you inside yourself completely and left no room for anything else, which was why she had loved it her whole life. At 8 o'clock, Lily arrived. She looked at Evelyn working on Daniel's motorcycle and didn't say anything, just went to her station and began the first task of the day. At 8:15, Carter Briggs walked into the garage and sat on a chair near the wall without saying a word. At 8:30, 3 more people came in and stood quietly. By 9 o'clock, there were 7 people standing in and around the garage, people who had arrived without announcement and taken their positions without direction, because they understood what was happening and why they were there and what their presence meant. Evelyn worked on Daniel's motorcycle and didn't look up. Lily watched the road, and at 9:17 on a Thursday morning in October in Cedar Hollow, Colorado, the sound of multiple engines appeared on the highway. Not motorcycles, not yet, trucks. 6 of them coming from the south carrying Mason Cole's entire crew plus the people he'd imported from 2 other towns for the occasion. He had decided this was the moment. This was the statement. The town would watch an old woman's garage get shut down, and Mason Cole's authority would be absolute and unchallenged, and everything would go back to the order he had established. He had planned this moment for days. He had not planned for what he found when he arrived. Lily turned from the window. Her voice was completely steady. "They're here," she said. Evelyn set down her wrench. She stood up slowly and straightened her back and looked at the people standing in her garage, Carter and the others, and Lily, and the faces of people who had come from hundreds of miles because she'd lived her life in a way that made them want to come. She looked at all of it. Then she walked to the front door and opened it and stepped outside. Mason Cole stepped out of the lead truck with the confidence of a man who had never once arrived somewhere and not gotten what he came for. I had 15 men with him. Evelyn counted without appearing to count. It was an old habit, spatial awareness, knowing the numbers in any room or space before anything else happened, before any other assessment was made. 15 men, 6 trucks, and Mason Cole standing in front of all of it, with his jacket open and his hands loose at his sides, in the particular expression of someone who had convinced himself that this moment was already finished and he was simply here to collect the result. He looked at Evelyn standing in front of the garage door. He looked at the people visible behind her. He looked again. His expression didn't collapse all at once. It shifted a small recalibration, like a man adjusting his footing on ground, that turned out to be slightly different than he'd expected. He covered it fast. But she saw it. She had always been able to see that moment in people, the moment when the situation refused to match the picture they'd carried in their heads. And she saw it move across Mason Cole's face in the fraction of a second before his control came back down over it. "Mrs. Harper," he said. His voice was still steady. She gave him credit for that. "Mason," she said. He looked at the people in the garage again. Carter stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, not doing anything, not saying anything, just present in the full and unmistakable way of someone who occupied space naturally and had been occupying dangerous spaces for 40 years. Behind him, others, more than Mason could quickly count or categorize, which she knew was part of what was unsettling him. He couldn't get a clean number, couldn't assess the situation the way he needed to, and that uncertainty was doing its work on him without a word being spoken. "You've got company," Mason said. "I've got friends," Evelyn said. He studied Carter for a moment. Something moved in his face. Not recognition exactly, he was too young to know the faces, but something like the recognition of a category. The understanding that the man in the doorway belonged to a type that Mason Cole had made a career of not crossing, and there were more of that type visible behind him, and this was not what he had planned for. "This isn't necessary," Mason said. His voice had shifted slightly, still controlled, but working harder at it. "Tell me what's necessary, Mason," Evelyn said. "Walk me through your thinking." It was a disorienting question, and she meant it to be. Men who operated on intimidation worked on scripts: threat, demonstration, capitulation. When the script broke, when the person across from them asked a genuine question instead of responding with fear or anger, the footing went uncertain. She had learned this a long time ago, and it had not stopped being true. Mason looked at her. He looked at the garage. He made a decision. She could see him make it the moment his jaw set, and he said, "We're done talking." He turned to the men behind him, and then the patrol car came around the corner. Not sirens, no announcement, just a patrol car moving at a deliberate, unhurried speed, and behind it a second one, and Deputy Sandra Wills stepping out of the first one with the flat professional calm of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment and had prepared for it thoroughly. Mason went very still. "Mr. Cole," Deputy Wills said. She had a clipboard. Roy had said she would have a clipboard, and she did, and there was something about the specific mundanity of a clipboard in this moment that Evelyn found almost moving the ordinariness of official procedure, the paper and the pen, and the measured steps that represented everything that separated what Mason Cole did from what Deputy Wills did. "I'm going to need you and your associates to remain where you are. I have some documentation to go through with you." Mason's eyes went from Wills to Evelyn and back to Wills. "What kind of documentation?" "The detailed kind," Roy said. He had come around from the other side, from the direction no one had been watching, which was characteristic of Roy Bellon. He had an instinct for the angle that wasn't being covered. He was holding a file folder that was thick with papers, and he handed it to Deputy Wills without looking at Mason, which was also deliberate, because not looking at Mason was a way of communicating that Mason Cole was in this particular transaction the least important person present. Mason's jaw tightened. "You can't." 11 businesses, Deputy Wills said, reading from the top page. "Documented over a 22-month period. Payment records provided by 3 business owners. Incident reports cross-referenced with payment dates. 2 eyewitness accounts of explicit threats. Property damage with photographic documentation." She looked up from the clipboard. "And a cooperating witness who was part of your operation for 14 months. The name Denny didn't need to be said. Evelyn watched Mason's face as he understood who the witness was. It happened fast, a flash of something raw and unguarded anger at a specific person rather than the situation generally, and then he caught it and put it away and his face went flat. "I want to call my lawyer," he said. "That's your right," Deputy Will said. "You can do that right now." And then the motorcycles appeared. Evelyn had known they were coming. She had known the timing. Carter had coordinated it, a simple signal, the kind of communication that didn't require words, because the people involved had been communicating this way for decades. She had known, and she was still not fully prepared for what it felt like to stand in front of her garage and hear the sounds she'd heard in another life coming down the mountain highway into Cedar Hollow. One engine first, then several at once. Then a sound that built the way. Certain sounds built, not loud, exactly, but present, filling the space between everything else until it was the thing you heard underneath all other things. 18 motorcycles came down the highway and pulled off in front of and around Evelyn's garage in a formation that was not planned in the tactical sense, but had the coherence of people who understood instinctively how to position themselves, how to occupy space meaningfully, how to be present in a way that required no words and made words slightly beside the point. They parked. They got off their bikes. They stood. That was all. Mason Cole's 15 men looked at them. 15 men who had arrived to deliver a statement looked at 23 people who had ridden from across the state to stand next to a woman who was standing quietly in front of a garage door. The math was not complicated. The math was not even really about numbers. It was about what the numbers represented, the fact that Evelyn Harper had called and people had come, which meant something specific about who Evelyn Harper was. And that specific thing was landing on every person in Mason Cole's crew, simultaneously, visibly, in the small shifts of posture and eye movement, in the particular silence of men who have walked into a situation and realized they have fundamentally misread it. One of Mason's men said something to the man next to him, not loud enough for Evelyn to hear. The man next to him didn't respond. Mason Cole was looking at Carter Briggs. Carter was looking back at him with the unhurried attention of a man with nowhere to be and nothing to prove. "This is who you are," Mason said. He said it to Evelyn, but he didn't take his eyes off Carter. "You called in? What an army." "I called friends," Evelyn said. "There's a difference. The difference doesn't change what's going to happen here." "Mason," her voice was quiet, "look around you." I didn't want to. She could see he didn't want to, because looking around meant acknowledging what was there. But something made him do it anyway, some remaining piece of honest assessment that hadn't been entirely smothered by ego. And he looked. He looked at Deputy Wills in the 2 patrol cars. He looked at Roy with the thick file folder. He looked at the riders standing beside their bikes along the highway. He looked at the people in and around the garage, and several of them were Cedar Hollow residents, she realized, because word had moved through the town, and people had come, not dramatically, not in a crowd, but individually. Quietly, the hardware store owner and Tom McGuire from the diner and Garrett Owens from the feed store, and others standing at a careful distance, but standing there visible present. The town was watching, not from windows this time, from the street. Something in Mason Cole shifted. Not broke, not yet, not visibly, but shifted, like something structural moving under pressure. A sound you felt before you heard it. "What do you want?" he said. His voice had changed, still controlled, but no longer performing confidence. Something more careful. Something that was beginning to understand that performance wasn't the right instrument for this moment. "I want you to talk to Deputy Wills," Evelyn said, "and your lawyer and the people from the state investigative office that Roy is going to call in the next 30 minutes. And if I don't, then Deputy Wills has enough to arrest you right now," Evelyn said. "And it happens publicly in front of your entire crew in front of this town. And the story that comes out of that arrest is the story that defines everything going forward." She looked at him steadily. "This is me giving you the option to do this with some dignity, which is more than you gave any of the people you've been taking money from for 2 years. Mason Cole looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. She had stood in rooms and in fields and on roads and in circumstances far harder than this one, and she had always found that the moment where something could go either way had a specific quality to it, a kind of held breath in the world, a pause before the weight fell on one side or the other. She knew this quality. She did not find it frightening. She found it clarifying. "You're not afraid of me at all," Mason said. It came out less like an accusation and more like a discovery. The genuine surprise of a man who had built everything on the assumption that people were afraid of him and had walked without knowing into the one exception. "No," Evelyn said. Why not? She looked at him for a moment. Because I've already met the version of you that I couldn't handle a long time ago, and I handled it. He absorbed that. Deputy Wills took one step forward. Mr. Cole, she said, I'm going to ask you one more time to step away from your vehicle. He looked at Wills. He looked back at Evelyn. He looked at his crew, and this was the moment Evelyn had been watching for, because how a man looked at the people he'd brought with him when he was starting to lose told you everything about what kind of man he was. Some of them looked back at him with the blankness of people waiting for instructions. Some of them were already looking away. Two of them, she noticed, had quietly moved slightly apart from the main group in the ball but definitive way of people creating distance between themselves and a decision they don't want to be part of. Mason Cole looked at all of it. Then he put his hands in his pockets and walked toward Deputy Wills. I'll talk to my lawyer, he said. It wasn't surrender, not exactly, not yet. But it was the choice of de-escalation over confrontation, which meant the moment had passed, which meant what had seemed possible 5 minutes ago was no longer possible, and everyone present understood that. Carter let out a breath, quietly, not visibly. Evelyn heard it anyway. She turned and walked back inside the garage. Lily was standing at the workbench with both hands flat on the surface, as if she'd needed something solid to hold on to. When Evelyn came back in, she looked up and her face did several things at once, relief and something she was fighting and something that was very close to crying, and the refusal to cry, all of it moving across her features in the honest, unguarded way of young people who hadn't learned yet to fully control their expressions. It's okay, Evelyn said. I know, Lily said. Her voice was steady. Mostly. I know it is. You did well. I didn't do anything. You stayed, Evelyn said. That was the job. Carter came inside. He looked at Evelyn and nodded once, the small economy of a gesture between people who had known each other long enough that small things carried large meaning. Wills has him, he said. He's on the phone with a lawyer. His crew is not happy, but they're not moving. Roy's on the phone with the state office. Good, Evelyn said. Two of his men walked away already, Carter said. Just got in a truck and drove off. Wills let them go. She's focused on Cole and the core people. Evelyn nodded. Evelyn, Carter said, and his voice was the kitchen table voice now, not the field voice. The one he used when something was over and you could say the real thing. It worked. It worked the right way, she said. That matters. He smiled. He had a good smile, Carter Briggs, the kind that rearranged his whole face. It does, he said. God, it does. Roy came in 20 minutes later with the specific expression of a man who had been building something for weeks and had just seen it hold. He sat down on the stool near the workbench and looked at the file folder in his hands and then at Evelyn. State Investigative Office is sending 2 people. They'll be here tomorrow morning. He paused. The documentation we have is sufficient for multiple charges. Cole's lawyer is going to advise him to cooperate. When they see what Denny gave us combined with the business records, cooperation is his best option by a significant margin. The businesses, Evelyn said, the ones that were paying him, what happens to them? They're witnesses, Roy said, not defendants. Their cooperation is what built the case. They'll have to give statements, probably testify if it goes to trial, but there's no liability on their end. She nodded. Tom McGuire, Garrett Owens, the hardware store, the laundromat, the motel, all of them, they would have to go through the process, the statements and the questions and the remembering of things they'd probably have preferred to forget. But they would come through it, and on the other side of it, Mason Cole would not be waiting. Roy, she said, thank you. He looked slightly uncomfortable the way people looked when they were given direct thanks and didn't quite know what to do with it. You built this, he said. I just helped with the paperwork. The paperwork was everything, she said. This ended the way it ended because the work was right, not because of who showed up in the parking lot. He nodded, accepting that. The day moved through its remaining hours with the particular quality of aftermath, not quiet exactly, but different from the noise that had preceded it. Mason Cole was eventually transported in the back of Deputy Wills's patrol car, which Evelyn did not watch. She heard about it from Tom McGuire, who came to the garage at noon and stood in the doorway and said, he's gone, in a voice that didn't know quite what to do with the weight of those 2 words. Sit down, Tom, Evelyn said. You want coffee? He sat down and she poured him coffee, and he sat at the workbench and was quiet for a while. Then he said, I don't know how to feel. That's normal, Evelyn said. I've been scared for 8 months. You'd think when the thing you're scared of goes away, you just feel. He shook his head. But it doesn't work like that. No, she said, it doesn't. Give it time. How much time? She thought about it honestly. Different for everyone, she said. But it gets lighter. The day-to-day of it gets lighter, and eventually you stop checking for it, and eventually after that you realize you haven't checked for it in a while. Tom looked at his coffee. 8 months, he said. How do you? He stopped. You did what you needed to do to protect your business and your people, Evelyn said. That's not weakness. That's someone who had no good options choosing the least bad one. There's no shame in that. He looked up at her. You didn't choose the least bad option. I had something most people in this situation don't have, she said. What? She was quiet for a moment. A reason that was bigger than the fear, she said. Most people's reasons are the same size as their fear or smaller. That's not their fault. That's just how the math works out. She picked up her coffee mug. You need to go back and open your diner, Tom. He almost smiled. You're right. I'm always right about when people need to go back to work. He laughed, a real one, which seemed to surprise him. He finished his coffee and stood up. Evelyn, he said at the door. He turned back. I heard what the deputy said about Denny the witness, about the evidence you and Roy put together. He paused. You built the whole thing, and then you made sure the right people had it at the right time, and you did it all without, he searched for the word, without becoming something different. She looked at him. That's harder than people think, he said. I just wanted you to know someone noticed. He left and Evelyn stood in the garage for a moment and felt the weight of what he'd said in the quiet, specific way. She felt things that mattered, not loudly, not with a lot of motion, but deeply down in the place where things settled and stayed. By late afternoon, the riders had mostly gone. They filtered out the way they'd filtered in, without announcement, without ceremony. Carter stayed the longest. He sat with Evelyn in the garage as the afternoon light changed, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with Mason Cole and everything to do with who they'd been and who they were, and the road between those two things. At one point, Carter said, Daniel would have loved today. Evelyn didn't say anything for a moment. He would have stood in the back somewhere, she said, and tried not to look proud of himself and failed completely. Carter laughed. That's exactly right. He was terrible at hiding when he was proud of me. The worst, Carter agreed. I've never seen anyone be more obviously trying to be casual. She smiled. It was a real one, the kind that lived in the memory more than in the moment, that looked backward at something warm. He'd be happy the motorcycle is getting finished, she said. Carter looked at the back corner where Daniel's motorcycle stood, with its new fork installed, the alignment checked and rechecked that morning and the hour before everything else happened. It looks good, he said. It's not done, she said, but it's getting there. Around 6 o'clock, Carter said he needed to head out long ride home, and he wasn't as young as he used to be, which was something she knew he said for her benefit because Carter Briggs had never been slowed by a long ride in his life. He stood up and she walked him to the door. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her. You gonna be all right, he said, the same question Denny had asked from a completely different place and with completely different weight behind it. I'm going to be all right, she said. This town deserves you, Carter said. I want you to know that. This town is mine, she said simply. I chose it the same way you choose things that matter, on purpose, knowing what I was doing. He nodded. He put his hand on her shoulder for a moment, one of those gestures that was too brief to be sentimental and exactly long enough to mean something. And then he walked to his bike, and she stood in the doorway and watched him go. That evening, after Lily had gone home and Roy had checked in one final time, and the garage was locked and quiet, Evelyn sat in the chair in the corner, the same chair she'd sat in the night after the break-in, and she let herself be still. She thought about what Tom had said, about becoming something different, about the hardness of doing what needed to be done without letting it change the person who was doing it. It was hard. He was right about that. She had felt the pull of it all the way through, the pull toward the older version of herself. The version that solved problems, the way that version solved problems, that used the particular authority that version carried without needing Roy's paperwork or Deputy Will's clipboard or Denny's 14 months of reluctant testimony. She had felt it and she had not used it. And the thing was, it had worked. Not despite the restraint, but because of it. The legal case Roy had built was solid precisely because she had insisted on building it. The town had seen something they could understand and hold on to and tell stories about precisely because it had ended with a patrol car and a file folder and a man on the phone with his lawyer, not with something that would have made the town afraid in a different direction. She thought about what Carter had said too, that every person who'd come had come because of who she was and not who she'd been. She sat with that. She had spent 20 years building a version of herself that she wasn't sure anyone noticed. 20 years of opening the garage and fixing motorcycles and being the person people came to when they needed something reliable, and the person who helped without asking for recognition, and the person who had chosen deliberately and with full knowledge the small and the quiet and the true over the large and the loud and the powerful. She had not known until this week whether it had amounted to anything. Now she knew. It had amounted to a retired marshal building an evidence package on her behalf. It had amounted to a 19-year-old staying at her post through fear. It had amounted to 23 people on motorcycles arriving at a mountain town in Colorado because someone they loved had needed them there. It had amounted to an 81-year-old man telling her a story about a woman his brother-in-law had talked about for 40 years, and the soft pride in his eyes when he said it. It had amounted to Tom McGuire noticing that she hadn't become something different, which was, she thought, sitting in the quiet garage in the mountain dark, exactly the right thing to notice. She was tired. Not the bad kind of tired, not the tired that came from having spent yourself on something that left you empty. The other kind. The kind that came from having done something fully from beginning to end with everything you had in a way that you could stand behind. She leaned her head back against the wall. She thought about Daniel's motorcycle in the corner, the new fork aligned and ready, the work almost done. She thought about Lily Carter, who was 19 and would wake up tomorrow in a town that was lighter than it had been yesterday. She thought about Cedar Hollow and the people in it, in the 22 years she had spent becoming someone they trusted. And she thought about trust as a thing you built the way you built anything worth building, slowly, quietly, material by material, day by day, without knowing what it would be worth until the moment it was tested. She closed her eyes. Outside, the mountain wind moved through Cedar Hollow. The garage held the quiet the way it always had, the familiar quiet of a space that had been worked in and loved and broken and repaired and worked in again, the quiet of a place that was still standing after everything that had been thrown at it. Evelyn Harper was still standing too. That was the whole thing, really. That was what all of it came down to. She was still standing, still herself, not harder, not colder, not reduced to what the situation had tried to reduce her to. Still the person she had spent 20 years deliberately and on purpose becoming. Tomorrow she would open the garage at 7. She would drink her coffee black. She would finish Daniel's motorcycle. She opened the garage at 7 the next morning. Nobody was surprised. Not Lily, who arrived at 8 with 2 coffees from the gas station and handed one to Evelyn without a word, the way you handed things to someone you'd gotten used to. Not Roy, who stopped by at 9 with the update that the state investigators had arrived in Cedar Hollow and were already set up at the sheriff's office reviewing the documentation package. Not Tom McGuire, who walked across the highway at 10 o'clock, stood in the doorway of the garage, looked at Evelyn working on Daniel's motorcycle and said, "You know, I thought maybe you'd sleep in today," with the tone of a man testing whether things were back to normal. "I don't sleep in," Evelyn said without looking up. "No," Tom said. "I guess you don't." He left smiling. She heard it in his footsteps, the lighter quality of them, the way a man walked when something that had been sitting on his chest for 8 months had been lifted, and he was still getting used to the absence of the weight. She worked on Daniel's motorcycle all morning. The new fork was in and aligned. The work remaining was careful, detailed, the kind that required patience over speed, not because it was beyond her, but because it deserved the patience, because this particular motorcycle had been waiting 9 years, and 9 years earned a certain quality of attention. She moved through it methodically, checking each connection, each tension, each measurement against the specifications Daniel had written in his small, cramped handwriting in the notebook she'd kept on the shelf above the workbench since the day he died. The notebook had survived the break-in. She didn't know if Mason Cole's men had simply missed it, or if some version of decency had stopped them from destroying a dead man's handwriting. But it was there, undamaged, exactly where she'd put it 15 years ago, and she worked from it the way she always had. Lily watched her work from across the garage, pretending not to watch, making herself busy with the parts inventory that didn't need doing until next week. After an hour of this, Evelyn said without looking up, "You can come over and look at it." Lily abandoned the pretense immediately and came to stand beside her. They looked at the motorcycle together for a moment. Tell me about it, Lily said. The real story, not the mechanical one. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She had a small socket wrench in her hand, and she turned it once slowly, feeling the weight of it. Daniel started building it the year before he died, she said. He'd been thinking about it for years. He had this idea for a custom build that combined things from different eras. He was very specific about what he wanted. Drove me crazy, actually, because he had strong opinions about every single component, and half the time, his opinions were wrong. Lily almost smiled. Did you tell him that? Constantly, Evelyn said. He ignored me constantly. He was very good at that. What happened when you were right? He pretended he'd changed his mind on his own and hoped I wouldn't notice. She looked at the motorcycle. I always noticed. I never said so. Lily was quiet for a moment. Why not? Because some things are more important than being right, Evelyn said. And watching him be happy about a decision mattered more to me than the satisfaction of pointing out I'd told him so. Lily thought about that. He sounds like someone worth missing. How was Evelyn said? Just that, clean and direct and completely true, with no performance of grief around it and no deflection from it either. He was. She still did. Both things were permanent, and she had made her peace with the permanence of them. She went back to work. The state investigators came to the garage at 11:30. There were two of them, a man named Calloway and a woman named Fresno, and they were the specific kind of professional that Roy had cultivated. Formal without being rigid, thorough without being theatrical, interested in what had happened without needing it to be more dramatic than it was. They asked Evelyn questions for 40 minutes, recorded her answers, asked several follow-up questions that she found intelligent and precise. And when they were done, Calloway closed his recorder and looked at the documentation on the workbench and said, "This is excellent work. The evidentiary package is thorough." Roy Bellant built it, Evelyn said. We're aware, Calloway said. We know Roy. He paused. We also know a little bit about you, Mrs. Harper. She looked at him. Not what you might think, he said carefully. Just your name has come up over the years in certain contexts. Old reports, old case files that cross-reference people who had nothing to do with anything we were investigating, just people who were in a particular world at a particular time. He held her gaze. Whatever was in those reports, none of it was negative. That's all I want to say. She nodded, once. Thank you for what you did here, he said, building this the right way. It would have been easy to handle it differently. Easier in the short term, she said, not easy in the ways that matter. He nodded and they left, and Evelyn turned back to Daniel's motorcycle, and Lily, who had listened to the whole exchange from the back of the garage with the careful attention she applied to everything, came forward slowly and said, What did he mean? Old case files, your name in Lily, Evelyn said. Right, Lily said. Right, sorry. Don't be sorry, you'll know when I'm ready to tell you. Lily looked at her. Will you be ready? Maybe, Evelyn said. Probably, eventually. She picked up Daniel's notebook from the shelf and opened it to the page she needed. Hand me the 12mm, please. The charges against Mason Cole came through 2 days later. Roy called Evelyn at 7:50 in the morning, which meant he'd been awake waiting to make the call because Roy Bellant was not a man who called people at 7:15 in the morning about things that could wait. 14 counts, Roy said. Extortion, criminal, threatening, conspiracy, organized coercion. The cooperating witness testimony is being considered for the federal enhancement. He paused. His lawyer recommended he take the plea, which means trial is unlikely. Which means the businesses don't have to testify, Evelyn said. Most of them won't. One or two may still be needed, but the bulk of the documentation does the work. Another pause. And this one had something in it. Something Roy Bellant, former marshal, 12 years of professional detachment, was not entirely managing to contain. Evelyn, I've built cases against people who operated like this. Usually what makes it fall apart is the documentation isn't there, or the witnesses won't hold, or the business owners recant because they're scared. We had all three. He stopped. What you built over 22 years in this town, the reason Tom McGuire trusted you and Garrett Owens talked to me and Denny walked into your garage of all places, that's why this worked, not the paperwork. Evelyn held the phone and looked at Daniel's motorcycle in the corner, which was, as of last night, 90% complete. Thank you, Roy, she said. Thank you, he said. And then after a moment, "It's been an honor." She had to stand still for a moment after that. The word honor from a man like Roy, delivered in the plain, undecorated way he delivered everything, was not a small thing. She put down the phone and went back to work. The town's reaction to Mason Cole's charges came in layers, the way things happened in small towns, not all at once, not in a single public moment, but gradually through conversations and kitchen tables, and the particular circulation of information that happened when people who had been afraid to talk to each other about something suddenly weren't afraid anymore. The hardware store owner, a man named Blake Simmons, who had been paying Mason for a year and a half, came into the garage on the third day after the charges and stood at the workbench and talked to Evelyn for an hour. He talked about the first payment, the specific feeling of writing the check, the specific shame of it, the way he told himself it was temporary and practical and not who he was, and the way that story got harder and harder to maintain as the months went on. He talked about watching his employees come to work, not knowing that part of their wages were going toward keeping a dangerous man satisfied. He talked about the night he'd almost called someone and hadn't. "Who were you going to call?" Evelyn asked. "You," and he said. "I was going to call you. I picked up the phone and I put it back down." "Why?" He thought about it. "Because I was ashamed," he said finally. "I'd already been paying for 5 months. I thought you'd judge me." Evelyn looked at him. "I would have answered the phone," she said, "and I would not have judged you." He looked at his hands. "I know that now." "You can know it going forward," she said. "That matters more." Garrett Owens from the feed store came on the 4th day. Earl Whitfield called on the 5th. He didn't come in. He called because his knees were bad and driving into town required a good reason. But he called and talked for 20 minutes and at the end said, "I always knew there was more to you than the garage." "There's the garage and there's the rest of it," she said. "The garage is the real part." "Both parts are real," Earl said firmly. "Don't sell yourself in halves." She thought about that for a long time after she hung up. Lily was watching her from the desk when she set down the phone. "What did Earl say?" "Something I need to think about," Evelyn said. "Good something or hard something?" "Both," Evelyn said. "Usually the good ones are." The thing she needed to think about was this: for 22 years, she had understood herself as someone who had left one life and built another. And she had held those two lives as separate things, the before and the after, the woman who had been and the woman she'd chosen to become. She had held them separate deliberately, consciously, because the separateness felt necessary, felt like the thing that made the choice real. But Earl had said something true that she hadn't quite permitted herself to think before. Both parts are real. The woman who had ridden with the Hells Angels and built a reputation that Reeves, a man loosely connected to Mason Cole's operation, had recognized across decades and run from, who had stopped conflicts without firing shots and been trusted by people who didn't trust easily, who had understood at 25 what it meant to protect people in a world that didn't offer easy protection. That woman was not a different person from the 64-year-old mechanic who had opened a garage every morning for 22 years and made herself indispensable to a small Colorado mountain town. She was the same person, the same character running through different chapters. And what had worked this week, what had made Roy want to help and Carter drive through the night and Tom McGuire trust her with one more month and Denny walk into her garage instead of anyone else's, was the whole person. Not the before or the after. Both. She sat with that understanding for a long time. It settled into something she hadn't known was unresolved until it resolved. On the 7th day after the charges, she finished Daniel's motorcycle. She finished it on a Tuesday at 4:30 in the afternoon, and she knew it was finished the way she always knew when something was done, not by checking every item on a list, but by the specific satisfaction of the last thing fitting exactly right, the completeness of it, the sense that anything more you did would be adding rather than finishing. She stood back and looked at it. It had been 9 years in the corner of her garage. 9 years of being covered and uncovered and looked at and thought about, and once broken and put back together better than before. It looked like what it was: a piece of work done by two people, one of whom was gone across a timeline that hadn't been planned. The front fork was new and perfectly aligned. The tank was the original, repainted in the original color, a particular deep blue that Daniel had spent 3 weeks choosing, and she had privately thought was 2 shades too dark, a fact she had never once mentioned. The engine had been rebuilt 3 years ago before the break-in in one of the quiet evenings when she'd needed to do something with her hands and had come to the garage and started working without fully deciding to. It was Daniel's motorcycle, and it was hers, and it was the sum of everything that had happened since he died, and it was finished. Lily came to stand next to her. They looked at it together. "It's beautiful," Lily said. "It's done," Evelyn said. "Those are the same thing." Evelyn looked at it for another moment. "Hand me the key." Lily went to the hook near the workbench where the key hung on a small ring. She'd put it there 3 years ago. Without being asked, had intuited that it belonged there, which was one of the thousand small things that made Lily Carter exactly right for this garage, and brought it to Evelyn. Evelyn held it for a moment. Then she walked the motorcycle to the front of the garage, out through the open bay doors into the late afternoon air. The highway stretched in both directions. The mountains were doing what they always did, being enormous and patient and indifferent to the small human dramas happening below them, which was actually a comfort rather than a diminishment if you understood it correctly. She swung her leg over the motorcycle. She sat for a moment. She had not ridden in 7 years. Not since the last time she'd taken one of the customer bikes out for a test after a major rebuild, which she always did because she needed to know the machine was right before she handed it back to its owner. She'd stopped after that, not because she'd decided to stop, but because the right occasion hadn't presented itself, and the years had accumulated around the absence without her noticing. She noticed now. Now, she put the key in. She started the engine. The sound of Daniel's motorcycle starting was not the sound she'd expected, and also exactly the sound she'd expected. She'd rebuilt this engine herself, knew every component in it, had listened to it, run in the garage more times than she could count. But the sound of it running with the motorcycle upright and her on it, and the open road in front of it, was different from the sound of it running on the workbench. It was the difference between potential and the thing potential became when you finally let it. She sat and let the engine run for a moment. She heard a sound and looked up. Lily was standing in the garage doorway, watching her with the expression of someone witnessing something they understand is significant without fully understanding why. Her hands were pressed together in front of her mouth, and she was very deliberately not saying anything, which was the right instinct. Evelyn looked at the highway. She thought about Daniel on this road, the roads before this road, the version of them both that had existed before Cedar Hollow, and the version that had found each other after. She thought about New Mexico and the third thing, the choosing, and she thought about 22 years of choosing and what they had built and what they were worth. She thought about the fact that she had promised him she would finish this. She had finished it. She pulled out onto the highway. She didn't go far, not because she didn't want to, but because this wasn't about distance. It was about the moment itself. She rode about 2 miles north where the highway curved slightly and the view of the mountains opened up on both sides, and she stopped for a moment in the absolute stillness of that. Then she rode back. When she pulled back into the garage, Lily was still in the doorway. She had been joined by Roy, who must have stopped by and found the garage empty and correctly identified where Evelyn had gone. And Tom McGuire was there, who had apparently come over from the diner. And Earl Whitfield, who had driven his arthritic knees 15 miles because some things were worth the drive. 4 people standing in a garage doorway on a Tuesday afternoon. She parked the motorcycle and turned off the engine. She sat on it for a moment in the quiet after the engine sound. Then she got off and turned around and faced the 4 of them. Roy said, "How does she run exactly right?" Evelyn said. Tom said, "God, that's a beautiful machine." Earl said nothing. He just nodded, the slow nod of an 81-year-old man who had loved motorcycles his whole life and recognized what he was looking at and didn't need to narrate it. Lily said he would have been proud. Evelyn looked at her. "Daniel," Lily said, "he would have been so proud of you." She said it simply, without decoration, the way you say something true. She hadn't known Daniel. He'd been gone for 2 years before Lily started at the garage. She was saying it from the stories Evelyn had told, and the notebook on the shelf, and the 9 years of watching Evelyn treat his unfinished motorcycle with the specific tenderness you reserve for things that held someone you loved. Evelyn looked at Lily Carter. 19 years old, glass, cuts on her palm, healed and fading, standing in the doorway of a garage that had been broken and was now whole, with the open, honest face of someone who had come to work one day and ended up learning something larger than mechanics. "He would have liked you," Evelyn said. Lily looked slightly undone by that. She recovered. "I would have argued with him constantly," she said. "He would have loved that," Evelyn said. He loved people who pushed back. Roy cleared his throat in the way of a man who is feeling something and has limited practice with that. I have an update if you want it, he said. Cole's attorney confirmed the plea agreement this morning. He's taking the arrangement, cooperating with the federal enhancement in exchange for the reduced sentence. His crew is scattered. Most of them have left the county already. The two who stayed are being interviewed separately. The businesses, Evelyn said. Most of them won't need to appear, Roy confirmed. The documentation and Denny's testimony do the work. Denny's been given a deferred arrangement in exchange for his cooperation. He's got community service and a year of supervised contact. He's 22. He'll be fine if he makes the right choices. Evelyn nodded. It's over, Roy said. Not triumphantly, just factually in the way Roy Bellant said most things accurately and without excess. It was over. She stood in the late afternoon in front of her garage and let herself feel that. Let it arrive fully the way she allowed herself to feel things that mattered, not performing the feeling for anyone watching, not managing or containing it, just allowing it to be exactly what it was. What it was relief. And under the relief, something older and quieter, something that lived at the level of conviction rather than emotion. The knowledge that she had done the things she needed to do in the way she needed to do it. That she had not at any point become something she wasn't. That the 22 years and the choice they represented had survived being tested, had proven real rather than theoretical had held. That mattered more than the outcome. The outcome was necessary, but the holding was what she'd needed to know about herself. Tom left first back to the diner, his step light in the way she'd noticed and would probably keep noticing for a while the specific lightness of relief. Earl left next, accepting Roy's offer to walk him to his car because of the knees and the dignity of being 81 and letting people help with the knees while not making a production of it. Roy stayed a moment longer. He stood next to Daniel's motorcycle and looked at it. Are you going to ride it regularly? He said. Probably not, Evelyn said. Maybe on occasion, the right occasions. What kind of occasion qualifies? She thought about it. The kind where it matters, she said. When something is finished, when a promise is kept, when someone needs to be reminded that there are people who choose things on purpose and hold to them. Roy looked at her for a moment. He had the eyes of someone who had seen a great deal and had organized most of it into sense, and was not sure this particular person fit any of the categories he'd developed, which was a conclusion he appeared to find more satisfying than unsatisfying. Take care of yourself, Evelyn, he said. I always do, she said. He left and she and Lily were alone in the garage. Lily was putting tools back in their places along the pegboard wall. The right places, because she'd been here long enough to know every right place without looking. She worked quietly, competently in the rhythm of someone who had made a place her own through the accumulation of days. Evelyn watched her and thought about what she wanted to say and whether now was the moment to say it. She decided it was. Lily, she said. Lily turned. You asked me once who I was before the garage, Evelyn said. Lily went very still. The answer is complicated, Evelyn said. It's the kind of answer that takes more than a conversation. And some of it I'll tell you when the time is right, and some of it you'll figure out from other people in this town who are going to tell you things over the next few months, because that's how small towns work when a secret develops cracks. She paused. But here's the part that matters. Before Cedar Hollow, I was someone who knew how to move in dangerous worlds. I knew how to protect people who needed it. I knew how to make decisions under pressure and live with them afterward. She held Lily's gaze, and I walked away from all of it because I chose something different. And the something different is this garage, this town, you. Lily's expression had gone through several things while Evelyn spoke and had landed on something that was trying to be composed and wasn't quite making it. Why are you telling me now? Lily said. Because you stayed, Evelyn said. You were scared and you stayed anyway, and you stood at the back of this garage with your hands flat on the workbench, and you did the job I gave you. And that tells me you're the kind of person who can hold information about the people they trust without it changing the wrong things. Lily was quiet for a moment. What does it change? Nothing, Evelyn said. That's the point. It shouldn't change anything because who I was before doesn't change who I am now. It explains some things about how I move and how I think and why I wasn't scared when I should have been. But the woman who opened this garage every morning for 22 years That woman is not a costume I put on. She's who I am. I know that, Lily said immediately. No hesitation. The kind of certainty that came from having watched someone closely for 2 years and having paid genuine attention. Evelyn looked at her. I know you know it, she said. I wanted you to know that I know you know it. Lily laughed. It was a small laugh, slightly wet around the edges, which she addressed by turning back to the pegboard and putting the last two tools in their places with more precision than was strictly required. Evelyn, she said, not turning around. Yes, I want to learn everything. Still not turning. Not just the motorcycles, all of it. Everything you know about how to handle things, how to think when things go sideways, how to be the kind of person who people call when it matters. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. That takes more than mechanics lessons, she said. I know. It takes years. I'm 19, Lily said. She turned around. Her eyes were clear. I have years. Evelyn looked at her for a long time. She thought about herself at 19, the girl she'd been sharp and stubborn and full of certainty that the world would meet her at whatever level she set. She thought about everything that had happened between 19 and 64, the road between those two numbers and the texture of it, the losses and the choices and the long middle stretch of choosing quietly and well. She thought about what it meant to hand something forward. Not a name, not a reputation, something real. The actual substance of what she'd learned, the understanding of when to move and when to hold, when to fight and when to stand still, when to call for help and when to be the help that someone else called. Daniel's notebook on the shelf, Lily's hands on the pegboard, the motorcycle finished in the corner. All right, Evelyn Harper said. 2 words, clean and simple, and completely meant the way she said everything that mattered. Lily nodded. She didn't make it dramatic. She turned back to the workbench and picked up the next task, which was a parts order that actually did need doing today, and began to work. Evelyn went to Daniel's motorcycle and pushed it carefully to its rightful place against the wall, not the corner anymore, not the waiting place, but the place of honor near the workbench where finished things lived. She covered it with a clean cloth. Not because she was hiding it, because it was done and done things deserved a rest. She stood in her garage. 22 years of her life were in the walls of this place, and the tools on the pegboard, in the customer, files in the cabinet, in the notebook on the shelf, and the photograph of Daniel laughing at something the camera hadn't caught. 22 years of mornings and coffee and the particular satisfaction of an engine running right when it had been running wrong. And underneath all of it, underneath the widow and the mechanic and the neighbor and the quiet woman on the edge of the highway that people had spent 22 years trusting, was the woman who had known always exactly what she was capable of, who had chosen deliberately and on purpose, and with full knowledge, what she would and would not use that capability for. That choice was the whole story. Not the fight, not the confrontation, not the riders coming down the highway or the patrol car turning the corner, or Mason Cole walking toward Deputy Wills with his hands in his pockets and his empire collapsing behind him. The choice was the story, made once long ago and kept every single morning for 22 years and tested and held and proven real. Evelyn Harper turned off the workbench light. She put on her jacket. She looked at the garage one last time, at everything it was and everything it held, and she walked out the front door and locked it behind her. Tomorrow morning she would be back at 7. She would drink her coffee black. She would open the door to this place that her husband had built with his own hands and that she had kept alive through grief and time and the deliberate daily practice of being exactly who she had decided to be. And if anyone ever came through that door again with the wrong kind of intentions, if anyone ever again looked at a 64-year-old woman with grease on her hands and quiet in her eyes and decided she was the easiest thing in the room, they would find out the way Mason Cole had found out the way anyone who had ever underestimated her had eventually found out what it meant to be wrong about a person. Not because she would become something different, but because she never had to. She was Evelyn Harper. She had always been exactly